Hello and welcome to HKA Talks To. Today we are joined by James Pickavance, a partner in the Global Disputes Practice at Jones Day. James, welcome.
Hi, how are you?
Very well, thank you. Thanks very much for joining us. I guess to start, it would be helpful if you could just give a brief overview of your practice and the type of work that you're involved with at Jones Day.
Yeah, sure. So I joined the firm last year to head up the construction disputes practice in London. I'm the only partner in London who has only practiced construction disputes for their whole career, although 4 of my partners have significant experience with construction matters as well as other areas. And there is an incredibly strong team of associates. To say that I've had a fast start would be something of an understatement. I'm heavily involved in a number of matters. They're very interesting construction disputes in different parts of the world, and that's testament in part to the blue chip strength of the disputes brand, which, as you know, for Jones Day is phenomenal and certainly helps us get foots indoors. The strength of the global construction practice is also deeply impressive, but perhaps most importantly for London, for me, for the international construction practice we're developing, is the connectivity between London and the 40 or so other offices around the world, and the willingness of other partners in those other offices to engage and I suppose share opportunities with the firm's clients. So I feel pretty lucky so far. In terms of the work that we've got on, so I would broadly categorise it into 3 sectors. There's some development work, energy, both oil and gas and renewable energy, and I have 1 infrastructure disputes matter, and that is consistent with the sectors in which the firm operates in the construction practice, albeit it operates in other sectors, but those 3 sectors are its strong points. So lots going on.
I'm interested to know, James, considering the current COVID situation, which is obviously impacting us all, how you and your team have adjusted to the necessary new ways of working.
Well, I think incredibly well is the short answer, and I don't mean that to come across in a sort of pompous way. It's testament to the firm's flexibility and the firm's support functions that within a week or 10 days, the entire firm, including its support staff, were taken out of our 40 or so offices and put online. And part of that is because we are, most of the lawyers are pretty mobile anyway. We're traveling around or we're working from home 1 day a week. But as you guys know, working from home 1 day a week or ad hoc is different to working from home permanently, particularly when there are children around, dogs barking and so on. So of course there's been a period of adjustment to that. I'd be lying if I said that there hadn't been, but I can say hand on heart that the firm and my team and London, as far as I can tell, has adjusted incredibly quickly, and everybody is now working just as if they were in the office. So it's been a fascinating and rapid transition from office to home.
Sure.
I think that's been it across the board, isn't it? I think a lot of firms didn't realise how capable they were of being able to have, such large numbers of their staff working remotely.
Yes.
And the technology's just developed at an incredible rate, and it's just made it possible. We're in a very, very similar situation, which is positive.
I wonder whether there's going to be an elastic band sort of snap back to the way things were, or whether things will change more permanently. But time will tell, I guess.
I think perhaps somewhere in between, a saggy elastic band, perhaps, not too far.
So we know that COVID-19 has had and continues to have a major impact on construction and engineering projects worldwide. And I guess we're curious as to kind of what issues are your clients typically dealing with at this time?
So in terms of legal issues, I would characterise the issues into one fundamental question that's been repeatedly and often urgently raised with me and some of my partners, and that is, what are my rights? Many clients are asking whether they should trigger force majeure clauses, or the other party has triggered a clause and they want to know what to do. In relation to force majeure clauses, the issues we've considered include whether the events fall within the force majeure definition, whether a pandemic is a force majeure event, whether the pandemic falls within the catch-all wording, like out of the party's control or not foreseeable, whether the consequences of the pandemic, such as government action, are within force majeure, the meaning of act of God, which varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, what they need to show, what parties, clients need to show to prove or disprove an entitlement to time and money. Does it still get the relief provided for where there is a conflicting entitlement? What's the extent of the duty of mitigation, and what practical steps should it take? So there is, and I'm sure this is the same for you and for others, there's a plethora of questions or issues just coming out of consideration of force majeure. But of course, it's not just about force majeure. That's not the only relevant consideration. Yeah. Change in law clauses have probably never received so much attention, just like force majeure clauses, as governments enact regulations which either stop or impact projects. Also advising on extension of time clauses, particularly in the context of FIDIC or FIDIC-derived bespoke contracts, where there's an extension of time arising from delays to completion caused by an epidemic or government actions. I think it's 8.4 of the FIDIC form. Suspension rights also relevant, and like EOTs and some other clauses, they usually provide a time and money entitlement, but I've been involved in a debate about the extent of the entitlement of costs on suspension, so whether it allows for the costs of demobilising and remobilising, and whether you can have partial suspension. That was an interesting one. The answer under UK law is perhaps more straightforward, because the Construction Act deals with that for projects that fall within its scope, but for contracts that are subject to different laws, the answer is less straightforward, arguably.
Yeah, sure.
I should say we're not just dealing with construction contracts. The pandemic has created project problems. So I'm not only advising on the construction contract, but the suite of agreements that surround it. So, for example, what does the joint venture agreement say? What's the scope of the MAC clause in the lender agreement? Yeah. What action should the project manager take pursuant to its reporting obligations in the PMA, and so on? So the trigger events, the notification requirements, and the relevant clauses, and also the clause mechanics and the entitlement to relief, they all vary according to which clause you're looking at, obviously, but also which contract you're looking at within the suite of project documents. So even answering the seemingly very basic question, what are my rights, it's sometimes a bit more complicated and requires a bit more thought. So that has consumed quite a bit of time in the past couple of months.
I'm sure. And just expanding on that point a little, I mean, we know that James Day has an international remit, obviously, and you yourself do a lot of international work. So I'm curious just to understand if you can expand on how, presumably they do, how certain different jurisdictions have dealt with the matter, have dealt with COVID-19.
Sure. Our practice is inevitably, as you suggested, our practice is inevitably drawn to those jurisdictions where the most construction and infrastructure investment is happening. So I've had to get involved in what's happening in various countries, China, Italy, France, Spain, as well as the UK off the top. And a lot of our clients are either located in those countries or have projects in those countries or depend on those countries for their supply chain. So providing an answer to the client's question means giving them a multi-jurisdictional answer rather than one that's confined to the jurisdiction where the specific project is located.
Sure. Yeah.
One example is a client who is building a gas plant in the Middle East, and it's relying on material supply from China. And it's finding that supply chains are interrupted because you may have heard about this, but the Chinese government are issuing what's called force majeure certificates, which are stopping companies altogether. So it's absolutely relevant to our clients to give them a global understanding of what's happening.
Yes.
And at least in the countries that I've looked at, and I think most countries, they've all experienced some sort of lockdown which has been implemented with varying degrees of severity and has lasted for different periods of time. Attached to each of those lockdowns has been an exempted list of activities, which again varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. If we're talking about the construction sector, and speaking very generally, I would say most jurisdictions have exempted workers supporting certainly the operation of public infrastructure, so roads, bridges, tunnels, so on. Ongoing construction projects have also generally been excluded either by a wide mandate that covers a particular sector, or by specific requests from companies or project stakeholders to exempt a project. And I think the backdrop to that is that governments recognise the importance of continuing construction projects because they're critical to essential businesses and critical to a much more long-term public infrastructure programme. And that's why they've been subject to the exemptions. And there's also the health risk issue. And I think, again, generally speaking, governments have been alive to that. So construction workers who are able to do their work in a way that doesn't involve them being close to others it is fine, but where the working space is confined, that has caused a problem because governments have often put in place, and the UK government is a good example, has put in place either mandatory or recommended guidelines to facilitate a social distancing environment, and that has had problems with the progress of the project. It's either stopped parts of the project or delayed parts of the project. So I think that's an issue. Governments have also implemented measures on public projects to help construction companies deal with the financial burdens they're facing. In the UK, I think there are examples where payments have been accelerated, certification of future interim payments, where work's not been done based on previous valuations. I think the French government has done that, increasing the frequency or order of payments, making advance payments and so on. So at least in respect of public sector projects, the government is trying to help out the stakeholders involved to a greater or lesser degree. What we're doing at Jones Day is tracking the announcements in states or jurisdictions that we consider to be of importance to our clients, so that if clients come to us and say what's happening in the UK, France and Saudi Arabia right now, we're able to give them a quick answer on things like the nature and significance of government orders to address the virus and the effect of government action taken to mitigate financial hardships. And I think that's really necessary for those countries where regulations are almost flying out by the day. I'm sure you're following what's happening in the US, but just the weight of regulations and announcements that are being issued across all the states is phenomenal. So it's important that we try and keep on top of that. I think overall it's quite a complicated mishmash, and there's no one size fits all to these issues. So we're being clear with clients that they must carefully weigh the considerations for a project on a case-by-case basis, based on the usual stuff, the contract language, the applicable law, the facts, and the particular circumstances, and the regulatory overlay that's being imposed by the relevant government. Just as there are so that's a jurisdictional viewpoint, if you like. Just as there are differences from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, there are also differences from sector to sector. So I'm not going to get into that now because there are lots of sectors relevant to construction. What we've done is we've written a paper that addresses how the impact of COVID has been felt from sector to sector, as well as from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. The sector paper, from memory, it covers real estate developments, oil and gas, renewables, transport infrastructure, social infrastructure and telecoms. So that may be of use to those that are interested in those sectors or interested in the jurisdictional overview piece. Both of those papers are already published, and if it's helpful, I'll send you links to the papers after we've spoken so that you can publish them with this podcast.
Thank you.
And James, sort of moving on to hearings, which are an inevitable part of a global disputes practice. Just keen to understand, have you or your team conducted any hearings over video link yet? And if so, sort of how did you find the experience? And when there are any particular observations on the way the tribunal responded, the style of advocacy, did you feel there were any differences there to what you'd anticipate in person? And then also sort of touching on the expert evidence as well.
It's a good question. We have had experience of it. I think it's been for litigation until a few months ago, video hearings were very much the exception. But for international arbitration, which is the forum that I typically resolve disputes in, video hearings occur much more frequently. So it's less of a shock to those that are more involved in arbitration than those that are involved in litigation. I think virtual hearings in arbitration are much more the norm for a couple of fairly obvious reasons. The first is that the relevant individuals are scattered. So take an example at the moment, we have a project in Saudi Arabia. One of the parties is domiciled in Spain, the other's in France. The legal team is split between London and France. The arbitrators are based in Toronto, London and Geneva. So pulling all those people together, physically together in one place, doesn't make a huge amount of sense, at least in an economically. So we had a CMC last month, which was conducted virtually. Now, would we have done that if it had not been enforced on us? I suspect in the old world, some people would have videoed in and some people would have attended in person. Yeah. I think now that everybody has had to work from Zoom or Teams or WebEx or whatever platform it is for such a long period, we're all sort of beyond the how does it work, this feels strange, panic. We know we can do it, we know how it works. Yes, there are some disadvantages to being face to face, but I personally think less than we thought. So to your question, how do the tribunal respond, or how do witness or factual or expert witnesses respond, and style of advocacy? I guess I'd make a few observations. The first is proximity between yourself and the tribunal. That's very different, rather than having 20 feet or so between you and the judge or the tribunal with lots else going on in the room, people shuffling papers, whispering to each other, whatever. In a remote hearing, you're close up. There's just a few faces. You may even be full screen. And so the focus is very much on you or on the people that are making submissions. So it's necessary, I think, to modify one's reactions and not make any remarks or do things that you would not ordinarily want the court to see. I found it important to remain or to keep in mind that the focus is very much on me when I'm speaking and not much else. The next point I make is body language with a tribunal and with the witnesses, whether they're factual or expert. as you know, a lot can be gleaned from body language, and certainly tribunals and witnesses, consciously or subconsciously, will give subtle or less subtle indications as to how they feel about a submission that you're making or that somebody else is making by their facial expressions, their interaction, the way they're moving, what documents they're looking at, whether they're awake, even what they're doing with their pen. Are they making notes on what you're saying? It's harder to gauge those reactions in a remote hearing, and it can almost be like talking to yourself. I think the way to deal with that is to, or the best way you can try and reduce the effect of that is just to take a bit more time to deliver a point that you might otherwise. Pause more frequently, I think, and check in that the tribunal or the witnesses with you and everybody's on the same page. And I think another point is, in virtual hearings, try to keep it as simple as possible. For whatever reason, when I'm in a virtual hearing or giving presentations, when I hear people go into a lot of detail about a particular point or a case or whatever it is, there's a tendency to gloss over. So I think in a virtual world, it's important to be as succinct, even more succinct than you would otherwise be in a face-to-face hearing.
Yeah.
The next one is communication. So leaning over to whisper to something into a team member's ear, or getting instructions by the way of a post-it note is not possible in the traditional sense. What we've done is set up WhatsApp group chats for groups of people to communicate. So you might have a group for solicitors and counsel, or between the client and their solicitors. But if you do, a sort of word of warning, if you do have more than one group, then just be careful that you select the right group to send a message to. Fortunately, I haven't.
Sounds like the voice of experience, James.
Well, fortunately, I haven't come across it on that point, but I've sort of had the message there in my hand. I remember on one occasion, and I had the presence of mind to check who the message was being sent to before I hit the send button. There's no delay send on WhatsApp. So once the button's pressed, the message is gone.
That's it.
A few other points. So it's getting used to the way that virtual hearings work, getting used to turning the microphone on and off. How many presentations have we both been in where somebody's speaking for 30 seconds or a minute and they're on mute? Make sure you're in a space that doesn't have any background noise. If you're at home, make sure your family know that you're not to be disturbed. I accept that is easier said than done sometimes. Again, they're presentation points, but if they're not dealt with, at best it's going to be embarrassing. At worst, it's going to be detrimental, because you might say something you shouldn't when you think you're on mute, for example.
Sure.
E-bundling is another one. That's becoming more common for in-person hearings, I know, but it's obviously essential for online hearings. I think done well, e-bundling is incredibly effective. It's so much easier to navigate the documents with hyperlinks and so on. I'm not sure it's a cost saving as compared to paper bundles. There's still the time spent assembling the bundle, checking it, and generally speaking, there is somebody from the e-bundle provider on hand. The cost of somebody from the e-bundle provider on hand during the hearing. So it's not necessarily cheaper, but if it's done correctly, I think it's better if you can get over not having a physical piece of paper in your hand.
Yeah.
So I guess overall, sort of taking all of that into account, I mean, do you think that kind of the video hearing process, can be detrimental to a particular party's position or the process in general?
I think it's easy to present badly if you're not well prepared, and if you haven't practiced in an online forum. And whilst, of course, what you're saying, the substance is more important than form. Anything you can do to avoid a bad impression with a tribunal is obviously a good thing. I think probably for anyone who is going to attempt an online hearing for the first time, or if you haven't done it for a while, it is almost certainly a good idea to do a trial run.
Yeah.
So make your submissions to a mock tribunal. Make sure the factual and expert witnesses also have a run through, because the more you practice the online way of doing things, the better you are going to present. I think the things that one loses from face-to-face hearings, like the sort of things I mentioned previously, so proximity, body language, ease of communication. I'm not altogether sure that these things can be completely overcome in an online hearing, but I don't think, well, my own personal view is that they're not hugely detrimental.
Okay.
But with the present technology, there's really no substitute for being in the room and picking up somebody's body language or communicating with the team. But as I said, I don't think you lose that much in an online world. It's a question of just getting used to how these things are done and how to present in a virtual hearing. But in any case, I think we're all going to have to get used to it, like it or not.
Yeah.
The way I describe it is that in the past 8-10 weeks, I'm losing count now, but in the past however long it's been, there's been a national, even global light bulb moment in the legal community and in the business community, in fact. And that is the sort of guess what, we can do this, and time will tell what impact this period has, whether we immediately go back to the way things were or we continue to do things in an online world. Charles, I think you were suggesting it's somewhere in between. I think that's probably right.
Just expanding on that point then, I mean, we've obviously talked quite a lot about what issues yourselves, Jones Day, yourself personally and your clients are dealing with at the moment. Yeah. But I'm just keen to understand, once your view on once lockdown is lifted, but to a greater or lesser degree, whatever that means at the moment, what issues you see arising or developing in the medium term? Do you have a view on that?
Yes, so there are a plethora of issues on, let's look at the front end for a moment. There are a plethora of issues on procurement. I suspect we're going to see changes to the bidding process, more emphasis on conducting due diligence of counterparties in the supply chain, more detailed contingency planning. Yeah. Obviously, risk allocation for unexpected events will form, I think, one of the main issues in negotiation for the foreseeable future.
Sure.
It might be that contractors are less willing to take on full EPC risk and responsibility for lump sum, and seek that for all or some of the contract scope that's priced on a cost reimbursable basis, or it might seek to have the project delivered on a more risk diversified EPCM basis, for example. Cash flow is going to be a problem, I suspect. We're seeing project sponsors and borrowers are encountering difficulties in drawing down on existing project loan facilities to meet their capital requirements. Everyone's tightening their belt, and in fact there have been situations where contractors are in compliance with the construction milestone and have yet to receive payment from the project sponsor because the funds have dried up, because sponsors are prioritising other payments. Mm. So that's a few issues at the front end, but there are many more. From the disputes perspective, whilst we've been frantically dealing with the what are my rights type question that I sort of outlined at the start, few disputes have formalised yet. Stakeholders are sort of in the process of inhaling the impact of the pandemic and are taking steps to manage the project, frankly, and mitigate the immediate fallout from what's going on. But I don't think it's going to be for the next 6 or 12 months, at least, until we start to see the impact of what contractual levers have been pulled or not pulled, and parties starting to formalise their positions in a disputes context. Mm-hmm. Having said that, we're thinking about what issues are going to come up in the medium term, the long term for our clients, and I'll just mention a couple. One issue that I've dealt with recently, and I think that's going to find its way into disputes, I suspect, is whether the contractor can claim costs arising from the pandemic or increased prolongation costs. Yeah. And the answer to that typically depends on the provisions of the contract, the law of the contract, and when during the project the additional costs were incurred, to name a few constraints. But if I give an example, which was is sort of derived from the issue that I had to look at. So the project was already overrun because the employer's culpable events, and during that period of overrun, the contractor incurred further costs related to the pandemic. The contractor's already notified the employer of its claim for an extension of time and money, but in this particular contract, the pandemic can't be characterised as a force majeure event because, let's just say, the force majeure clause provides an exhaustive list of events, or the force majeure clause just doesn't capture pandemic. Yeah. So there's no force majeure trigger. Mm-hmm. The question there is, what's the contractor's entitlement? And the answer to that question is going to need to consider things like the impact of a but-for causation test on the analysis, the assessment of the parties' entitlement on a fair and reasonable basis, which is often the contractual test to be applied for costs arising from delays. But yeah, fundamentally, what is the impact of the pre-existing delays that were being that were causing the project to be overrun on the entitlement to additional pandemic costs? Let's tweak the scenario a bit. So it might be that the project has suffered delays to the completion date because of the employer culpable events, and again, the project's overrun. The contractor's prima facie entitled to time and money as a consequence of that delay, of course, and it notifies its claim. There's then an event, the pandemic, which falls within the scope of a force majeure clause and in of itself causes further delay to completion. In this example, the employer issues the force majeure notice, and the force majeure notice only entitles the contractor to time. So the question there is, what's the entitlement where there is a sort of, for want of a better term, competing entitlements in different clauses? And again, parties are going to have to consider the impact of the causation analysis on the entitlement, but also whether the force majeure clause affects that entitlement.
Yeah, of course.
And it might be possible to contend that since the force majeure event is expressed as a neutral event, which doesn't provide for a monetary entitlement, that this acts as a supervening event which overrides the contractor's entitlement under the extension of time provisions. Alternatively, it might be argued that the contractor can't claim costs that cannot be causally connected to the original delay. So whilst the contractor can claim the costs for the entire delay period, costs such as demobilisation, remobilisation costs from the site or repatriation costs are causally connected with the force majeure, which doesn't entitle monetary recovery. Those are just a few of the considerations, and it'll depend on, as I said, it'll depend on the particular words in the contract and the circumstances that surround it. So that's one issue. Another issue I think is almost certainly going to arise is the extent of the relief available when the works have been delayed or stopped, where there is a duty to mitigate. Mm-hmm. I think rather than assume that there's a moratorium on all works, owners and contractors right now need to carefully consider whether they're under an obligation to continue works, and if so, to what extent. So it might be possible to continue the procurement of materials, the placing of orders, or the carrying out of design. There may be an obligation to carry on those works, but if that's not possible, then that needs to be documented very clearly, and it's going to be advisable, or one would have thought it would be advisable to have a paper trail of the mitigation measures that have been taken. So, for example, where a party is procuring goods from a foreign jurisdiction where there are no restrictions, those goods are due to be shipped to a different jurisdiction where there are restrictions. Has the party sought to get an exemption from those restrictions so that it can fulfil its obligations and get that item that it is contractually obliged to supply delivered? Has it carefully checked whether or not the activity it wishes to perform is restricted or has been mandated by the government as an essential activity? As I said earlier, the mishmash of regulations and communications from the government and the length of and detail and sometimes inconsistency of the essential works, or however it's termed, needs careful thought.
Yeah.
It's going to be necessary to show when the dispute arises that basically the relevant party has done what it needs to do to satisfy its contractual obligations. So if that's the contractor, has it done what it needs to, what it possibly could do to perform its obligations, but it wasn't able to because it was prevented from performing them because of regulations or whatever. Sure. If it's possible to demonstrate that the works couldn't be resequenced or resourced so that other works could be advanced, that might be a line of argument that the employer, for instance, might take if the contractor is claiming an extension of time to an activity or to a section of the works. It may be necessary. It might be a necessary step under the contract to do that, and if it doesn't do that, then it precludes an extension of time. So the sort of what obligations can continue and what obligations have to stop by virtue of the force majeure events, the pandemic, or the consequences of the pandemic, that requires some careful unpicking, I think, and that is going to lead to disputes. I will say, just to close the answer to this question, I mentioned we've done papers on the impact of COVID on different sectors and in different jurisdictions. We're just finishing a paper on a forward-looking paper on what issues we see arising in the medium and long term as a result of COVID. We're just editing it now. Hopefully it will be published by the end of this week or early next week, and it'll be up on the Gems Day website, and I'll probably push it out on my LinkedIn as well. But I'll send you a link to that as well in case you want to share it with your clients.
Excellent. That's good.